diplomatic, and other ideas that should lead to an American victory over the Chinese People's Republic of China. And give us an overview of those issues and what we should be doing as freedom-loving countries to address that.
Great. Well, thank you, Congressman Pittenger, and thank you, everybody, for being here and for the important work that this forum does to bring the world together on critical issues. And before I go into the two books, which on one hand, China's Vision of Victory was one of the first books to lay out the Communist Party's global grand strategy using their own words and their own documents. And then Decisive Decade, after years of explaining Chinese grand strategy, the purpose of the second book was, what do we do about it? Is it possible for us to win this long-term geopolitical contest with the Chinese Communist Party and to do it peacefully, where we retain the power and advantages that the U.S. and the free world need to have? And I think we can still do that, and we're going to get into that today. But Matt Pottinger's speech is just a perfect way to set this up, because you can see exactly what the Communist Party intends to do, the sort of obfuscation and, frankly, lies that they use to tell the world and sort of lull us to sleep as they simultaneously prepare for war, attempt to take over the global economy, and ultimately to lay the foundations for economic, geopolitical, and military domination of nations worldwide. That's if they succeed. But we have this moment in time, which I wrote about in China's Vision of Victory. We have the next 10 years back then, so the whole of the 2020s, the decisive decade in U.S.-China relations and in China's relations with the world, to prevent this turning point in history that the Communist Party of China envisions is going to happen for them. We can prevent all that, we can stop them, and I think we can do this if we work together. It's going to be led by the United States. We're a $30 trillion economy now. We can take on the economic challenge, but we are going to need the world to come with us. And in Decisive Decade, I put this into the classical arenas of American and sort of Western strategic thinking. So diplomacy, information and ideas, military and economics. And I reprioritized that with economics first. That's where this is won or lost. Really, this is going to be about getting into the fundamental Communist Party grand strategies that are based on the economic rise of China, the taking over of the global economy, the conversion of that into military power, diplomatic power, and what they call the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. We can stop that now, so that's where we're going to have to focus. And then in turn, we're going to have to execute, I think, across the alliance system, a military buildup that means that China, together with its partners in Moscow and Tehran, that they never really believe they can win a war against the United States or against the West, and therefore you can maintain deterrence in the Pacific. So those two challenges are the paramount challenges. The economic arena is where I think we win or lose the long game, but then the military side is just essential. We have to get that done as fast as we can. We are losing time on that, and we've already seen wars break out around the world that are backed by Beijing, whether in Ukraine, whether in the Middle East, and with a looming conflict in the Pacific that they're telling us very clearly is their intent.
Yes, sir. Thank you. In your book, Decisive Decade, you outline a strategy called economic containment.
Right.
Could you give us some clarity in terms of what that means?
Absolutely.
And, what that entails for countries around the world?
Right. So economic containment, the way I see it, I mean, first of all, we look at the rise of China. It would not have happened without access to the American market, to American and allied technology, and to the capital markets of the U.S. and essentially capital investment from the U.S. That's how you got a country that was essentially agrarian in the 1980s into a technological and now, almost military superpower. So we allowed them to rise. The rise of China is really based on their engagement with the West. We did that, I think, really blindly and foolishly. But their continued rise and many of their strategies still depend on that. They still depend on access to markets, technology, and capital from not only the United States, but especially the alliance system. So you take the military allies of NATO and the Pacific, that's already more than 50% of global GDP. It's much more than that of global wealth, and it's much more than that of global capital markets. Beijing still relies on that. I mean, that's where they run their trade surpluses that allow them to finance, in turn, the global grand strategy, the Belt and Road, all the rest of it. If we start to shut down their access, the two pillars that I proposed in my economic strategy was, one, the economic containment of China, and two, the reconstruction, rebuilding, reindustrialization of the United States and the alliance system. So in economic containment, you basically want to cut off their access to technology, markets, and capital. And that just changes the game entirely. The rise of China ends when you start to cut those three things away. And we can do that through policy tools that we already have. And the net result, I mean, we have to ask ourselves, if we go through with this, and the target lists are very obvious. I mean, China's entire economy, I mean, if you look through the 5-year plans, you know, people talk about civil-military fusion, but what the basis of the entire economy is really party economic fusion. The party is involved in every single aspect of economic life in the People's Republic of China, whether it's corporations, banks, technology, strategies, general industrial policies. It's a party-led, party-designed economy, and therefore it's all targetable through corporate entities and initiatives that they have designed, which are very clear, and all of which could be subject to U.S. sanctions, import bans, export controls. Basically, the last 100 years of U.S. economic statecraft could all be applied to target lists of our choosing in this very, very large, you know, general strategy that they have, and that's where you disrupt it. You know, and ultimately, if we succeed in going through with these sorts of initiatives, we're going to have a bifurcated world economy. That's how I described it in Decisive Decade. You're going to have a bifurcation. So we shouldn't expect to see the kind of globalization we've had of the 30 years after the Cold War and the advent of China into the WTO. I mean, what you're really going to have is the separation of the Chinese economy from the Western economies based on some fundamental incompatibilities. For example, China's goals in technology, the fact that technology, you know, software and hardware, I mean, those are parts of pretty much every important 21st century industry. I mean, we know the party's intent. We know how it uses its corporations to spy on our countries to create influence. I mean, those things are just going to be incompatible. And as you start to put sanctions and pressure on the PRC, whether it's for its support of Putin in Ukraine, whether it's for you know, predations and sort of malpractice of its companies abroad, all of that is going to start to you know, create a separate China-Russia bloc. And then the question becomes, what happens to third-party nations, to non-aligned nations around the world? I mean, that's going to be very important because China's basic strategies do include, as we all know, through the Belt and Road, the economic and geopolitical dominance of Asia, of Africa, of Latin America, of Eastern Europe, and many other countries and sort of regions that it sees as essential to its long-term dominance. So countries are going to have to pick a path. You know, fundamentally, the U.S. is the world's largest economy, the world's largest demand center. And frankly, if we utilize that correctly, we're going to present massive opportunities for other countries to trade with us, to work with us, to do business with America, to choose the alliance system, not the Communist Party. And I think that will create real options for countries that see that and that get on the right side of these issues.
Dr. Ward, in our forum last December, at the closing remarks, one very brilliant Parliament member from Kenya addressed our delegates and made the statement, said, "Sir, we have made commitments to China in our country that we can't keep. We have debt obligations now that we can't maintain. And as a result, we are selling our national assets to address these commitments. We need help. Please give us advice on how we can work our way out of these debt traps." So if you could, give us a precursor, an understanding of how those nations that need help end up hurting themselves as a result of these obligations. I had one Parliament member from Africa say to me, well, he's a finance minister, and he said, "Sir, if we need help, we go to our ambassador, who goes to your ambassador, who then goes to your State Department, who then goes to your Congress, and then in maybe a year or a year and a half, we get some help." He said, "If I go to the Chinese, I get a check in 3 weeks." But in reality, what occurs? What is the debt trap involved in that relationship?
Right, and this is a great example, and I remember this from last year's forum where we had this very powerful statement from a Kenyan member of parliament saying, look, our national assets are being given, sold to the Chinese, and there's nothing we can do because of the debt we've taken on. And that is the playbook. Do not let them tell you otherwise. That is the playbook. They're going to come in with China-owned, China-made ports, infrastructure, all of it. They bring in their own engineers. We all know this now because this playbook has been run in country after country, continent after continent, to the detriment of nations that fought for their freedom. And frankly, in the 20th century, one of the most important things that happened was the throwing off of colonialism. And many countries are about to experience that again under the boots of the Communist Party of China. That is the long-term game. The long-term game is to own the trade routes, own the infrastructure, own the markets of countries that would otherwise be free. And that is not free market capitalism, that is not enterprise, that is Chinese economic imperialism. And that's what countries have to stand against. And these projects are ripening across the world, whether it's Kenya, whether it's the port of Chancay in Peru, where Peru had to execute new laws in their parliament in order to permit ownership of the port by the Chinese Communist Party and its corporations, whether it is Pakistan, which we now see as a total debt trap disaster, is one of the centerpieces of the Belt and Road, whether it's the ports and infrastructure in Sri Lanka, whether it's Laos or Cambodia. I mean, across the world, we're seeing the Belt and Road projects ripen at the expense of sovereignty of nations. So that is the choice that wise nations should not make. And for the U.S., together with our allies, the real question is, how do we get into this game fast? And what that's going to take, in my view, is the mobilization of the American private sector. Because at the end of the day, the U.S., we are a $30 trillion economy, but it is mostly private companies and free enterprise. And we need to get our own banks into the game of global development. We need to get into global trade and mount a counteroffensive against the Chinese state-owned and state-backed corporations. And we need to do that together with our allies, because many of the real infrastructure corporations and other investment banks that are regionally focused come from the U.S. alliance system, not from the U.S. alone. And we're going to have to start competing and looking for opportunities in the major emerging markets. So, this is something where government, I think, in the 2020s, we're going to have to learn how to work very efficiently with private sector to engage in markets abroad and create real options for countries that are seeing these sort of China dangling dangling in front of them the prospects of permanent debt and ultimate subjugation. So it's going to be our private sector, our banking systems. We're going to have to do that together. I think we're going to need an allied sovereign wealth fund that's focused on the Indo-Pacific, for example. We need to, I was speaking to somebody from a trade association the other day who was telling me about all the opportunity he saw in Africa. So, I mean, there are major optimists in some of our trade associations and businesses, looking at countries like Africa that think that there's a lot of opportunity there. I mean, we need to get our businesses into the picture. That's going to be how we play this game.
Case, come up here. Case, you. So I have additional questions, but I thought perhaps at this time you might have a question that you'd like to ask Dr. Ward, and so I'm going to open up the floor for a minute, and Case is going to bring the microphone to you. I hate to wake you up. So do you have a question? All right. John Strand.
Jonathan, you do a great job. As you probably know, I'm probably one of the leading experts when it comes to Huawei globally and done mapping of the infrastructure operates level across the world. I've just spent a lot of time in Latin America, and to be honest, the Latin American policies for decades have been a disaster. Now you can say you get a head of State Department, which understand the region, speak the language, and in many countries he's a rock star. One of my friends in Venezuela said if running for president in Venezuela, he will get 200% of the votes with the way they count. But the reality is, do you really believe that we financially can match what the Chinese is doing across the world? One-to-one. We had a case here some weeks ago where Blinken was next to Chile, 2 seconds. Peru, and giving something like $6 million or whatever it was to some train stuff. And the week before, or 2 weeks before, China was opening a $1.5 billion harbor in Peru. do we really believe that we can match it one-to-one, if you could say like that, going back to what Robert said in the beginning about how fast they can do it? Or shouldn't we try to use the nearshoring, the de-risking production that we say that move production out of China to other countries in Asia, create wealth to them, do the same in Latin America? So we say, listen, the best way we can help you is moving production out of China and to other countries, and in that way create a sustainable wealth instead of just a check. Because we know these checks, when they're paid out, they're gone, and next week they want a new check. Yeah?
Okay, no, great question, and I think that's a really wise summary of this. I mean, first of all, that's right. You don't want to compete dollar to dollar with failing state-owned enterprises. If you take the state-owned corporations on the Fortune Global 500 and crunch the numbers on the top, 100, and they have I think a net income of about 2%, 1.5% if you exclude the banks, which is sort of fake numbers anyway. So you're talking about unprofitable Chinese state-owned corporations backed by, problematic banking. So first of all, once we start targeting the right elements of the Chinese state-owned economy, the SASAC corporations, the Zhongyang Huijin, sort of central, entire financial architecture of the Communist Party, once you start putting the right kinds of sanctions on those things, they're not going to be able to finance their outbound grand strategy to begin with. On the other hand, U.S. capital advantages, once we start looking for opportunities in emerging markets, once we start to pool that, and I think get our banks across the entire OECD involved in the question of where is there real ROI in the emerging markets, how do we actually pursue that? Once we start pushing China back, I think we will start to see openings where there are real business opportunities. And second of all, matching them one for one is not something. I don't think that's the intent, but you can do certain things through like the Development Finance Corporation, through a potential allied investment bank, those sorts of things, through our major multinational banking sort of architecture that we already have, to go after projects that are real as opposed to strategic projects that are basically the foundations of a long-term geopolitical empire for the CCP. And I think the other piece of this is as we start to disengage from China, by definition, there's going to be nearshoring, reshoring, friendshoring, and anything but China shoring. And that's going to be a huge opportunity for countries around the world. And what countries are missing through engagement with China is they're essentially engaging with the largest production center in the world. Their industries are throttled early. They do not have that opportunity to move up the value chain to sell to developed markets. We can create that opportunity for other nations. And that's going to create a lift that will in turn create investable opportunities for U.S. and allied finance. So I think that's the virtuous cycle we want to create. You take China out of that equation, and that virtuous cycle is going to begin in many places around the world. And then you can rebalance world trade where it's led by America and not by China.
Thank you. Another question.
Good morning. I'm Catalina Crespo, Ambassador of Costa Rica. I'm very interested in what you're saying, and I agree that the private sector is an important piece of it, not the entire piece from the U.S. What would you, and I would be talking about Latin America. Costa Rica, our number one commercial partner is the U.S., we are one of the few countries left in Latin America that can actually say that. And that is a problem for the United States, even for Costa Rica also. So if you look at private sector, that's one area. However, I know that many countries, my fellow Latin American countries, have been trying to negotiate unsuccessfully with the United States for free trade agreements. Central America, DR CAFTA has one, but I know a lot of South America countries do not. So it seems like in the last 20 years, there's been, kind of not paying much attention to your neighborhood overall, regardless of who's been in power. And I think this is one of the, the port in Peru and many other things that are happening. But what would you recommend? First, the upcoming government, but also knowing that everything has to pass through Congress and Senate, what would you recommend them as a strategic view to work with Latin America, but also with Africa and the rest of the world? Thanks.
Right. Well, thank you. Right, and I think one, we're about to have, I think, a really a great Secretary of State. I mean, Marco Rubio, I think, is a very inspired choice. He's one of the people that one would immediately pick if one were thinking about the big picture on China. So that's going to be a very important moment. And I expect that our attention to Latin America is going to return. I mean, that's already a big conversation in Washington. We know that we have, I think, lacked strategy, lacked engagement with the region for a long time. And now we are seeing the results of that lack of strategy through China's very deep engagement with the entire region, and China doing that through its standard playbook of outbound infrastructure and essentially commodities trade and all the rest of it. So, I don't think we have a strategy yet for that, but I think it's clearly going to get some attention. And, the potential for trade engagement is going to, I think, accelerate quite a bit as we pursue a disengagement from China. I mean, if we start with USMCA, where you take, that really could be an enormous counterpoint to the PRC in general, creating industrial power through the integration of North America, the likes of which China can't actually match when you account for cheap, enormous energy advantages that we have, where you account for potentially much lower cost labor in Mexico. I mean, if you start to get that together in the right way, we're going to create a supply center in addition to a demand center. And I think naturally the hemisphere is going to start to cohere around a revitalized North America. And then pushing China out, which is a separate question, so that countries aren't losing their sovereignty and that so China isn't making gains. I mean, that really starts, again, with pursuing the battle space as it exists. China's state-owned, state-backed corporations and banks. That just has to be our target set, and we'll see them roll back anyway, and then the U.S. has to re-engage. But I think it's going to be a major growth spot. I also think there's going to be much more corporate and banking engagement and private sector engagement.
Sir, you and I wrote a joint op-ed in the Fox Journal regarding the role that China has played in the war in Ukraine, in the Middle East, the interest objectives of North Korea. North Korea. Kind of give us your perspective and understanding of the central role that they have done, the role they played to undermine liberty and freedom throughout the world.
Sure. So I think the most explicit example is in Ukraine, where right before that, in February of 2022, Russia and China came out together with the no limits, the famous sort of no limits partnership agreement, which is actually a very substantive document. It's 30 or 40 pages. It explains the entire sort of scope of the relationship. Xi Jinping pledges his support for Putin against NATO, and Putin pledges his support for Xi Jinping in Taiwan. And the next thing that happens is, of course, the invasion of Ukraine. And then from then until now, we've seen joint exercises with strategic bombers, with their navies, with their armies. It's a pretty deep military relationship. So, China is forming this anti-Western axis. And as Congressman Pittenger and I wrote in our article, it's essentially bankrolling the destruction and attacks on the free world that we're seeing from Europe to the Middle East and obviously in the Pacific itself if they actually initiate conflict there. So what they've done for Russia, first of all, that war I don't think would have happened, and it certainly would not have continued as long as it had without direct economic support from China, direct industrial support, and direct technological support from China, all of which now is clearly known, even though that intent was clearly visible at the very beginning. We now know that. Then in the Middle East, where you have Iranian proxies attacking Israel, and you now have the wars taking place there, China has been the fundamental backer of Iran, not only through an energy trade, but through investment pledges for most of its strategic industries on a 25-year timeline. So, they're bankrolling this axis. And then, of course, North Korea is its own separate element of this that only survives through the engagement that it has with Beijing economically. That regime is essentially dependent on China still. So that's what we're dealing with. It's not just the economic challenge from China. It's the fact that they always envisioned the violent destruction of the US-led world order, what some call the rules-based order, what others call the sort of general free world. This was always there. As Xi Jinping has told us back to 2015 or 16, preparing to fight and win wars. They've designed their force structure accordingly, and then they've begun to support these wars of aggression. So the other thing that I think has come out since we were last here in December, which I think has been known to many people, but now has been, I think, very clearly and factually established thanks to this Congress and the China Select Committee, is the PRC, the Chinese government's direct role in the subsidization of fentanyl precursors, which now the scourge of fentanyl that we've had in this country has killed nearly 500,000 Americans. So China's wars of aggression include not only its support for Ukraine, not only its support for Iran and Iranian proxies in the Middle East, but also what many, I think, serious national security leaders have now called the chemical poisoning of the United States. As the former chairman of that committee, Representative Mike Gallagher, has put it, it's the equivalent of shooting down a 747 every day when it comes to American deaths. We now have each year more deaths from fentanyl than we had in the combined killed in action deaths in Korea and Vietnam. So there's a direct assault on the United States as well, and we're all in this. So, you know, that's what they're doing.
Sir, what would you say to those who convey that China has peaked? That they're on the decline? That it kind of undermines the whole concern related to that China is our foremost adversary. What is your response to that?
Sure. So there's a theory that became very popular in Washington over the last, let's say, couple of years that's called peak China. Basically, China has peaked. It's reached its zenith. It's no longer a rising power. You know, it's in the start of real decline. Its demographic challenges, its debt challenges, its slowing economy, all of those will eventually do it in, and it will not be the dominant power in the 21st century. And I think there are two issues with that. The first is that China has already successfully established itself in some of the prime positions in the world economy that are incredibly important to strategic power. So first of all, it is the top trading partner with the majority of the world's nations. It's also a $20 trillion economy, which makes it, you know, slightly less than 20% of the global economy. It also has the largest industrial base by far. It is double the manufacturing base of the United States of America now, and its export growth is increasing. Its trade surplus is increasing, and this is all based on the fundamental strategies of the People's Republic of China that they've successfully executed on and done so, I think, with astonishing success. So the economic troubles in China are real. The housing crisis is real. If that turns into a financial crisis, then it becomes genuinely more important. The slowing growth rates are important. But as a geopolitical power, China's rise still continues. We have not yet taken the corrective action that we will need. And frankly, this problem doesn't go away without dedicated, focused, and successful efforts from the United States, from our allies, and from the free world as a whole. It is not something that's going to disappear overnight. And even if you get down to falling growth rates, even if they're growing at 4% off a $20 trillion base, they're adding, you know, that would be $800 billion a year. So, I mean, that's a pretty significant addition. And meanwhile, they are checking off industry by industry all across their lists in Made in China 2025 and the 5-year plans. They're successfully checking off prime positions in many of these. I mean, you can look at the electric vehicle market that matters a great deal to Europe. I mean, everybody knows that story. You can look at the battery market that underpins that. Everybody knows that story. You can look at the critical minerals and rare earths. I mean, that's a significant problem. They've just banned the export of certain critical minerals to the United States now in retaliation for our own export controls. You can look at the legacy semiconductor market. I mean, that's very important. You can look at microelectronics as a whole, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Telecommunications, we have our Huawei expert here. I mean, their story is one of economic ascendancy still and the conversion into geopolitical power. And then as Xi Jinping puts it, the unlimited stage we have for our era. Backed by the invincible force of 1.3 billion people, we have an unlimited stage for our era. So we're not even close to finished with this. We're just getting started, and the U.S. response is just beginning to take shape.
Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Deputy Speaker Antonio Albano from the Philippines, and we would like to welcome everyone in February 3 and 4 in Manila, and we expect you guys to be there. But there's one prevailing question that I would like to ask the United States. It seems that in your book, Dr. Ward, You're saying the economic containment is very important, and yet for the double standards, the United States and China has the biggest surplus trading partners. And most, if not all of your industries here are actually providing the impetus for economic growth for China. And that's one thing that they're using as their economic gains to build their military buildup, which is affecting the Philippines as we see it right now, and the world as well. And so your policy of economic containment is actually very important if you choose to put policies in the United States and ask your private corporations not to deal with China, so that you can ask other countries as well in Latin America, in India, and everywhere else to follow suit. And what would be the best comment that you could have, especially that the Trump administration is closing down its trading
Thank you, sir.
partners for that?
Great question.
Thank you. And I'll say to that, one, I could not agree with you more. This strategy is not yet underway. It's the strategy I've proposed for my country, and I think it's the way forward. And in my book, Decisive Decade, former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster wrote the foreword to the book, and I asked him to address it to the business leaders of the United States and to the business leaders of the free world, because we can't do this without our CEOs and major corporations, and America must take these steps. I mean, you are absolutely right. So much of my own work and advocacy over these years has been to the business community, with the business community, to explain the risks that they face in terms of their own companies in the China market and in global markets because of China, but also where they fit into grand strategy, because America cannot succeed at grand strategy without its companies. That is actually how we won the Second World War. It's how we won the Cold War, and it couldn't be more important now because we're actually going head-to-head against Chinese corporations. Those are the fundamental instruments of their grand strategy, and to have economic containment successfully adopted in the United States is the only possible way to communicate that to the world, but we're all going to deal with this one way or the other. I mean, Matt Pottinger brought up the example of India, which has banned TikTok and a whole bunch of Chinese apps. They've done that before we did. So there are countries that are ahead of us even. I mean, the Philippines has been, it was one of the examples I used in China's vision of victory, where China, essentially banned agricultural imports from the Philippines and let those rot in the docks. And that was their way of, pushing against you for their illegal territorial claims. So we are all going to deal with economic coercion. I think economic containment of China is the right path forward. It's something we have a unique moment in which to do that. The U.S. must lead it, and hopefully the world can come together on this, and we can reshape and restructure a world economy that still provides opportunity and prosperity for the vast majority of nations and does not continue to underpin the geopolitical conflicts that China envisions.
Bottom line, the Chinese market is still too intriguing for Wall Street.
Well, they're losing money.
And quarterly reports drive that.
And the other thing is businesses are going to lose a lot in China. It is not going to be as easy as it was for the last 20 years. The hard part's coming.
Yes, sir. We've got just one brief question, if we could.
Okay, very fast. You were talking about sanctions and about using sanctions regarding China. How do you see Europe's role into aligned Europe role in this? Because we have this, Europe now just imposed this new type of screening, the FDA screening, and almost all EU countries except 4 countries do some sort of screening. So what do you think in this new Trump administration will be, how this alignment on China will happen regarding screening of Chinese investors? And the second question is, what do you do to promote more Taiwan, to promote business from Taiwan, to promote Taiwan in general? Because on the other hand, I would see the backing of Taiwan much higher in the near future in turn. Thank you.
Very fine questions. I think, one, a lot does depend on U.S. and European economic alignment. You combine our two economies and you get to a very, very large chunk of the world economy in general. And I think really it's about best practices. I mean, we have to be aligned in the military alliance system. We have to be aligned on export controls. We have to be aligned on things like CFIUS. I mean, there should be best practices applied across the alliance system. We should be aligned on outbound capital. And, you know, we should be aligned on sanctions regimes on particular corporations and those sorts of things, like our own entities list. So, you know, and what that's going to mean is, I think, first of all, it means expanding our sense of what is required here. I mean, right now it includes a fairly limited list of you know, general technologies. That's where the Biden administration's been focused. But I think we have to expand it more to deal with China's actual economic strategies. So you take, for example, the Made in China 2025 sectors. That's where we should be focusing our sanctions and aligning our sort of joint allied packages. And then in the meantime, you know, transatlantic trade is largely pretty powerful in terms of services. The goods trade probably could increase, and that will all be hashed out, I think, in the next 4 years or so. But, you know, we have to come to a common understanding on the economic strategies that drive the People's Republic of China and how to counter them together. And it starts with the alliance system.
Thank
and
you,
with,
sir.
With regard to Taiwan, if we wanted to.
Thank